All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are today going to be covering the fundamentals of podcasting and really learning about the basics of creating a narrative and a podcast that people are going to want to watch, right? And the expert that we have with us who's going to be hosting the workshop is Martin Danner. And Martin and I met we met through San Diego Tech Hub, and I think most of you have either been to San Diego Tech Hub, one of the meetings, or in some way are associated with that organization. And if you aren't, it's a phenomenal organization that brings together entrepreneurs in the in tech fields and entrepreneurship, and really has helped our San Diego ecosystem thrive and become better and better all the time. So I met Martin that way, and he was he very soon after we met, we did a podcast together. It was right before we opened the rec, and we thought at that time that the rec was going to be open physically on campus, and then everything shifted and the entire world shifted, and now here we are. And podcasting is ever more relevant in this world of COVID-19 and our virtual world. So a couple of just housekeeping things to let everybody know as we're moving along. The workshop is, if you saw in the Eventbrite, there was an error. It's not going until 2 o'clock. We'll see maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, and we'll kind of play it by ear. It is interactive. If you have questions, please ask. I would encourage you to put your questions into the chat feature. And it would be great if you do that rather than unmuting and asking out loud. And we'll take regular breaks so that we can get something to drink and answer some questions, right? Answer some questions. So I think that's all the housekeeping. Am I missing anything, Martin, for logistics or housekeeping? Or
nope, that sounds about right.
And you can tell why he's a great podcaster, by the way. I love your voice. It's such a soothing voice.
Well, thank you.
With that, I'll pass it on to you, Martin. So go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Tanya. You know, I got to say, nobody likes hearing their own voice, and I had trouble with that as well. I thought, oh my God, that's terrible. But you get used to it. So hang in there. Anyway, first of all, I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for showing up. I really appreciate you taking your precious time to do this today, and I'm going to do my best to make it worth your while. I've got a ton of information to share with you, and it's going to be a bit of exercise in drinking from a fire hose, and that you may get saturated, okay? But don't worry, like I say, we're going to make the slides available afterwards. But I do have one request to make, and that is the fact that this is actually the first time I've done this workshop. And I really, really, really would appreciate your feedback. So what we'll do is we'll publish out a link to an online survey afterwards. And if you could just take a moment to fill out the survey, I will send you a link to the slides. How's that sound? Okay, now let's go about doing some screen sharing here.
Would you like me to go ahead and share the icebreaker poll, or?
Not yet.
Not yet. Sorry. I'll wait. You just tell me what to do.
Okay. You know what? Actually, that might be kind of a fun thing to do right now. Let's do that.
Okay. Sounds good.
So, okay. So with that, well, maybe many of you know each other, but I certainly haven't met you. So it'd be kind of fun to do with a icebreaker. And so what we've done is put together a poll with a very important question. So if you could take just a moment to answer this. And we'll see just exactly how people are coping with this living, you know, in self-isolation. So there we go. I know it's kind of a personal question, but.
Looks like right now we have about 13 of the 17 who've answered. So we'll give it just a minute or a little bit more.
Okay. You know, it's so fun to see on TV and what have you, all the different things people are doing with Zoom and the the bands playing together online and what have you. And it's fun to watch the comedians play with this whole situation and the fact that most of us are just dressing up from the waist up. So
All right. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, it looks like we have just about everybody who's answered the poll. So I'm going to go ahead and end it.
Okay. And it's totally anonymous. So
anonymous. Can you all see the results?
We probably should have mentioned that up front.
Oh, I should. Yeah, I should have mentioned that up front. I don't know if you can see the results.
How about that? 4 in 10 are actually wearing pajamas. Good on you. And I'm glad that you have your video muted. Thank you. Oh gosh, that's great. Okay, so let's talk about podcasting, shall we? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And here we go. Tanya, is that coming through okay?
Yeah, I can see it just fine, yes.
All right, so this is definitely a crash course. And like I said, I'm going to get through it as fast as I can, given the time constraints. But we also will have plenty of time for questions, and we'll have question and answer periods throughout. So as Tanya mentioned, do go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand feature of Conversayer, which is under the participants button, I believe, to ask a question actually out loud. So, okay, here we go. Before we get into the podcasting itself, I'm going to talk a bit about myself. Now, I was born and raised in the USA, but I'm actually a New Zealand permanent resident as well. I lived down there for 10 years and currently residing in Carlsbad. My career has been mostly around software development. Strangely enough, I do not have a long and illustrious career in media or podcasting. This is actually kind of a new career for me, you see, because I'm semi-retired. I am still working with my son, who's still down in New Zealand. We started an IT company down there, and I actually work part-time remotely, providing support and administrative duties. So that's a lot of fun working with Jason. I might mention that one curious little fun fact is that I actually was a TV news director at age 13. Now, before you think that sounds impressive, it was actually for a local cable TV station, but we actually did a newscast 5 nights a week. So that was a lot of fun, to get out of school and get on my bicycle and pedal on down to the TV station and go do a newscast, and learned lots of great things, met some great people. But at some point I decided, you know what, it's probably better off going back to being a kid. And so I gave up my TV career and took up surfing instead. And I think that was probably a smart move. Now, let me tell you about Conversayer. This is something I started about a year ago, and it's I call it my pay it forward passion project. And really what I'm doing here is I've got a podcast network that's focused on this notion of helping the leaders of tomorrow make the world a better place by honing their communication skills. And we're using podcasting as the medium, because it's relatively easy and inexpensive to get into. Video is a big thing these days, but I think podcasting is a good place to start, because video there's just a lot of complexities involved there to do it properly and to do a professional job of it. So we're focusing on podcasting, and the idea behind this project, if you will, is to provide 3 things. 1, training on the art and craft of podcasting, what we're doing right now, to provide internships to folks who are interested in learning how to do podcasting by actually working on real shows. And then finally, grants for those who have a great idea for doing a podcast that really kind of meets the criteria that I just described, this whole notion of making the world a better place. So that's what we're up to. It's still very much in the early days, and I'd say that a good part of that is not quite in place yet, but that is where we're headed. So that's Conversayer for you. Now, let's kind of set the context of the whole podcasting thing by giving you a short history. Now, it turns out that the word podcasting was first coined and really brought into popularity around 2004. It was previously known as audio blogging, and that has roots dating back to the 1980s. But with the advent of the broadband internet and portable digital audio playback devices like the iPod, which was originally introduced in 2001, this notion of podcasting, this term came around and it's kind of stuck. It first showed up at an article in the UK Guardian in 2004. That's the first known documented use of the term. So there you go. Now, let's talk about the podcasting universe. And I guess the whole point of all this information, and I apologize for the busyness of this slide, but the point is that it's just taken off. It's going crazy. And people are saying it's just in its infancy. Now, in terms of, say, for example, ad revenue, it's not even close to what, say, television gets, or maybe even radio. But it's certainly growing way faster than any of the other media channels, if you will. So there's lots of opportunity for it, lots of room for growth. Actually, it's kind of leveled off recently, and the main reason is because a lot of people like to listen to podcasts while commuting. Well, nobody's commuting these days. So that market has kind of disappeared to some extent, but it'll come right back once our quarantine lockdown situation starts easing up. So lots of room for growth. And I suppose the other thing to consider about that is that there's also a lot of competition. Right now, that 900,000 actually should be a million, because it's now over 1 million podcasts out there. And they measure that by how many have registered with these distribution channels like Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and Spotify. But it pales by comparison to the number of blogs out there. So if you're blogging, you know, it's really hard to get noticed. Podcasting, it's hard to get noticed too, but not as difficult. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, now, one way to keep track of what people are listening to is actually going to this site called chartable.com. And I think that if you want to start a podcast, it's a really good place to start, because it's good to know, well, what are people listening to? And then of the shows that are popular, how are they put together? How are they produced? And so you can go to Chartable and get all this information quite easily. So I might mention that these programs are all categorized into different genres, and there's a bunch of them. Oh, here we go. Before I get into the genres, I wanted to say that Chartable actually collects statistics from 4 different services, and that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and Stitcher, which are really kind of the 4 main ones. There's other distribution platforms for podcasts, but those are kind of like the big 4. And those are the ones you'll probably want to put your podcast on. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But you'll notice below there, they've got lots of different categories, and they also have it split out by geographic location. So here's some of the genres that they categorize. This is what Apple Podcasts use to categorize the podcasts that are registered with them. And so you can see that there's a whole bunch of different genres. Hopefully there's a genre in there that covers what you want to do. Actually, this is not even the complete list, but wait, there's more. Here we go. So you can see there's all kinds of categories to choose from. And let's do another pop quiz, shall we, Tanya?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so here's a little quiz for you. And the question is, which one of these categories is the most popular? Oh, you can select only one. And again, the responses are anonymous. So go ahead and pick the one you think is the most popular out there and submit your answer. How we doing, Tanya?
Yep, looks like we've got just about everybody. One or two not done. I'm going to go ahead and close the results.
And the results say, oh, news and popular come out first. 0 on comedy, isn't that interesting? And 0 on health. Okay, well, the actual answer is that society and culture is the most popular one, believe it or not. In fact, those are listed in reverse order of their popularity. So society and culture is most popular, followed by business, then comedy, news and politics, and then health. So hopefully what you have planned falls in one of those categories. And that might even be something to consider as you do some planning on your podcast and exactly what it is you want to produce. Okay, so any question at this point about the podcast universe? The world of podcasting that we're existing in? Tanya, do we have anything?
No questions on the chat. So if you do have any, again, feel free to let me know.
Okay, well, we'll zip right along then. Anybody, did I hear something? Nope. Okay, well, let's move along then. Let's get into the real meat of this workshop, and that is starting your own podcast. Right, well, there's a few steps to really pull it off, and these are the steps, and we're going to go into each one in more detail. So let's do that. We'll start off with planning. Now, as part of the registration process, you got access to a link to this podcast planner, which is a Google Doc I put together to help you really kind of sit down and give some thought as to what it is you want to do with your podcast, if in fact it's right for you, if it's the right way to go about things. And so hopefully some of you took the time to start filling this out. We're not going to go through all the answers today, but I will be happy to go over those with you after the workshop if you like. Now, what I'd like to do though is to suggest that we have a quick exercise here to answer just these 3 questions. And if you've already worked on your podcast planner, then you already have the answers to these 3 questions. If not, just take a minute or two to come up with your answer to these questions, and we'll let folks share them. Okay. Tanya, we really do need that Jeopardy music right now, don't we?
Exactly. So I do have a question while we're letting everybody fill out those or answer those questions.
Yeah, sure.
I did have a question. It was from Paula, and she asked, in the podcast universe, is it similar to the music industry in that you are forced to pick a genre, even if you fit into more than one genre?
Yes, but you can pick multiple genres actually. And you'll notice that when you look at those chartable charts, you'll see that some of those podcasts are listed under multiple genres or categories. And I'm not sure, but I think Apple Podcasts only lets you, well, it lets you choose multiple categories, but it only will publish you under the top or the primary one.
Great, thanks. Does that answer your question, Paula? Thank you, yes.
Okay.
So do we want to go ahead and open it up to the audience to answer? Or
well,
I'll leave it to you, Martin.
We can do that. Now, folks, do you know how to raise your hand in Zoom? Tanya, can you give them a quick tutorial on that?
Okay, so as far as I know, I could be, actually, I don't know how to raise my hand. And I can't give a quick tutorial.
I think you go to the participants button, on the little toolbar at the bottom.
Yes, I see this.
And then you can raise your hand from there. It's either that or chat. I'm not sure which.
I know that you can give a thumbs up and you can clap. You gotta raise hands.
Okay.
It is. It's in the participants. You just click on that, and then it's the bottom left corner. Raise hand.
There you go.
It must be because I am the host that I don't have it on mine. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Billy,
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Billy. Now I'm really, really eager to hear some of your ideas. So please raise your hand. and Tanya will call on you. Surely somebody must have an idea for what they want to do.
Maybe I'm not seeing the hands raised.
Okay.
Well, I raised my hand.
Okay,
and-
so I'm not seeing it. I'm sorry about that. It's just
Okay.
yeah. So thanks, Billy. What was your question?
I think that the most interesting thing that I've been listening to is the quote unquote fake news versus a lot of research being done with certain podcasters that really, they really are telling like more truths than quote unquote fake news.
Mm. So are you talking about a podcast that's like a fact-checking kind of thing?
Yeah. So they just go into what's going on in the world and with the news that's being put out by the major channels. And then they just really get into it and talk about it.
Ah, very cool. That sounds good. Is that something that you want to start?
Billy, is that something that you want to start, or does that already exist?
No, it exists. It's kind of like the Drudge Report.
Oh, okay. I see.
Mm.
Now I see where people have raised their hands. I see that Melvin has raised his hand. Did you want to?
Yeah, well, I kind of missed a little bit. I had a customer that I had to help, but just looking at the exercise and listening to Billy's question, I currently listen to podcasts that are they're more, I guess, like peek behind the curtain type podcasts where you have somebody that's well known and they'll just, kind of just start talking about a topic that they're probably not known for. Like a football player talking about rap music or something like that. It's just kind of like a peek behind the curtain type podcast.
Oh, okay.
Oh, very cool.
Something that you were thinking
Sorry.
about doing something similar to
Yeah,
that.
there's a few names I could throw out there. It's Joe Rogan, Jacko, and Tim Cass. Jocko, sorry, and Tim Cass.
Absolutely. That's actually where I got my inspiration. I have a couple buddies of mine where we've been kind of playing around on Zoom, and we just talk crap for hours on end, and because that's what we do in person. And we've had people kind of walk in on us while we're talking crap in person, and they would tell us that we should do something like that to broadcast.
I'd listen to that podcast.
I like it. Yeah.
And we're all veterans. We've all been in the military, so we have all kinds of crazy stories.
Oh, awesome. Is that what you'd like to do then? Is do a podcast where maybe you have a conversation with some of your military buddies about experiences you've had?
Yes, and experiences and just life in general.
Yeah.
It's kind of how we see life. I mean, it's like I said, it's more like an open flowing dialogue where we just kind of sit around and talk.
Great. Wonderful. Good idea. Tanya, anybody else?
Yeah, there's a couple more that have raised their hands. Paula, raise your hand.
Hi there. I'm interested in starting a podcast. First of all, because I think people are interested in screen-free options, even though you might look at the screen to start it, but being able to listen while you are either in a different space or environment, but you're not focused on the screen. And that would complement the purpose of the podcast, which would be to guide purposeful daydreaming sessions, which is what our startup is about. And it would be nice to interview somebody, either a local person or anybody who might have an interesting story about how daydreaming plays a role in their personal or professional life, and then have some sort of complementary purposeful daydreaming session with audio that goes along with that.
Nice.
Really
Good
cool.
deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do have one more. Jacob has raised his hand. Jake, do you want to?
Yeah, I thought it'd be pretty cool to do a small local podcast and summarize like ASG stuff, do interviews with students and or faculty at Miramar.
Very cool. Well, I know where we could put that.
Yeah, for sure. And you bring up a good point, Jacob, in the sense that, we all think of podcasts as being some global thing, but in fact, podcasting can be very much a local thing as well. There's no reason why you can't use the very same technology to create a podcast that just maybe addresses a very small community that's either locally or a small community of interest that might have might be geographically dispersed. Okay, Tanya, any others?
That looks like it. Did I miss anyone? No, it looks like that's it for the hands raised.
Okay, hey, thanks everybody. Those are some great ideas. And, again, I'll be putting up on the screen afterwards a link where if you wanted to have a Zoom chat about that and explore it further, then I'd be more than happy to do that. Okay, so let's move into the preparation phase. Now, there's a few things you need to put together to create a podcast. First of all, you need cover art or a logo that communicates the theme of the podcast. You need to select some intro music you might use at the beginning and the end of the podcast. And then you need to plan the first episode. So let's dig into those. Okay, cover art. It needs to be a graphic, either a PNG or a JPEG, and it has to be at least 1400 by 1400 pixels. Now that might seem really large, but that's the standard. That's a requirement to get published, say, in Apple Podcasts, as well as some of those other distribution platforms. You can go as high as 3000 by 3000 pixels. But you'll notice on the image there at the right, this is what it ends up looking like on a typical podcast app. It's it's a tile of many of the podcast apps that the listener subscribes to. So you want to make sure that the lettering is very clear and bold and large, so that it shows up even when it gets reduced to a small tile. Okay, now intro music. If you're a musician, great. That'd be great to record your own, but most of us are not so talented in that field, and so there's a number of sources online for what they call royalty-free music. Now, royalty-free doesn't mean that it's free. All it means is you don't have to pay per performance. In other words, you pay once for a license for it, and that license entitles you to play it an unlimited number of times. So Shutterstock has this site called Premium Beat, which has some really good stuff. A tune typically sets you back about $50. Audio Hero also is a site where you pay for tunes, and again, I think that's probably the going price, around $50 a tune. Zapsplat, on the other hand, offers actually royalty-free music that's actually free to use. Now, the caveat there is that you have to attribute the music to Zapsplat, and that can be easily done by just mentioning that in the end credits. So those are just three. There's many others out there. Just simply Google royalty-free music, and you'll see a bunch of sites. Right, any questions about any of that?
No questions.
No questions. Let's move along. So, planning your first episode. Now, the first thing I need to think about is, well, what is going to be the format of my podcast? And let me kind of explain to you what I mean by format. So here's one format where it's just you recording in a solo. There's nobody else involved, no other voices. And that could be quite a good format, but it also kind of has its challenges, in that it's just yourself in an empty room talking into a microphone. So you don't get the advantage of the back and forth with somebody else. And so it's kind of hard to kind of keep up the energy level. That sort of format is best for things like, political commentary, which is what the Ben Shapiro show is all about. And maybe about storytelling, which is what LeVar Burton does. He's got a great podcast there where he reads fiction stories for kids of all ages. And it's also, if you're going to do a podcast, using podcasts to do training, I mean, you could do that solo as well. All right, this is by and large the most common format, and that's the interview. That's typically a one-on-one type situation. where you're interviewing a guest, and you might interview, different guests on different episodes, that sort of thing. So I didn't put any examples because there's just so many of them. It's like there's really kind of no point, and that's probably what most of you are thinking about doing. Okay, now the next one is kind of a variation on that. It's called the panel discussion, and that's where you have a number of people just talking back and forth. In this picture, we have the hosts of a podcast called Pod Save America, and these are a few Obama White House staffers who offer pithy opinions on various things, have political, okay? So that's a political commentary podcast. And I might mention that they also don't hold back on the salty language either. So personally, I don't find that necessary, but I guess that's okay in this day and age. And there's certainly you don't have to follow the same standards you do for on-air broadcasts. So it's a lot looser. There's another one there called Spitballers. And what that is, that's three dads who basically just have a chat, and it's and they just cut it up. It's a comedy show, and they just laugh at life. So Melvin, that might be quite something similar to what you're thinking about doing. So that might be something you'd like to check out.
I was thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, another one is conversational. And again, this is just people talking back and forth amongst themselves. And a good example of that is a podcast called Office Ladies. It's a comedy podcast, and I guess they just make fun of life as well. But it's very, very popular. And so I guess the question then becomes, well, what format is best for you and best for the episode that you want to create? So I've created a form, and I will share a link to you folks to it. It's actually an interview guide for helping you prepare a podcast episode that's in the interview format. And what it does is it just helps you kind of get your thinking together so that you have the information you need in front of you when you conduct the interview, and you're not looking around and trying to figure out, well, what's what. And it's good to identify the questions ahead of time and to let your guest know some of the questions you'll be asking. And the way I put it to them is that these are some of the questions I'm likely to ask, because when the interview actually starts, it's okay, and it's actually a good idea to let it flow wherever it naturally goes. Additional questions might occur to you as you go along that follow on to the answers that are given. One thing's for sure, you don't want to ask all of the questions here on this interview guide because that's way too many. All right, so you need to prune it a bit and maybe add a few of your own to come up with a guide that's appropriate for the person you're interviewing.
And Martin, I have a question for you. It was actually from Jake. He was, but before I forget about the music, how long should that introductory music be? How long should you play the music for?
An intro should be in the neighborhood of 30 seconds. 30 seconds or less. And what you can do is if you're using advertising, you can also kind of build a little mention of the sponsor in that time as well. And what I like doing is I like to actually start the dialogue before the music's completely faded out. So the music might actually be there for another, say, up to 10 seconds, slowly fading away as the actual podcast gets started.
Great, thanks.
Okay, man, I got a lot of question slides, don't I? That's probably a good thing. And I would say that we're moving along at a good clip here, which means that we definitely will not all be here till 2 o'clock, and I'm sure you're all glad to hear that. Okay, now, the next step here, this is we're going to kind of get into the technical end of things, recording and editing. So the very most important thing that's going to affect your sound quality is the microphone that you use. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then, of course, you need to set up some recording space. in an area that you can find some peace and quiet. You need some software to record and edit the podcast. And there are some interesting apps, if you will, that can do all of the above. And finally, we'll talk about remote interviews. Okay, whoops, went too far. Okay, so first thing we need to think about is a microphone. And these are some of the more popular choices for podcasting. The one on the left is a USB mic, and what that means is it can plug directly into your computer through the USB port. So that's a popular option. Another one is the XLR mic. These are microphones that are designed to be plugged into an audio board. They're an analog microphone. And so you need a device like that red thing that's called an audio interface to take that analog signal and convert it into a digital signal, which then is comes in your computer again through a USB port. So the USB microphone effect is those two components built into one unit. And some USB microphones also have an XLR jack, so you can use it either way. If sound quality is like super important to you, then the XLR is the way to go with a good quality audio interface. Because these USB mics, they tend to have an okay audio interfaces built in. And you know, for podcasting, that's usually good enough. Right, so here's a picture of the audio interface actually plugged into everything. You'll see that it's plugged into two microphones. That's the two big plugs on the left. And then two smaller plugs on the right are your headphones. And then you'll see coming out of the back of that red audio interface box is a USB cable, which plugs into the computer. And the computer is then running some audio recording software. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, here is the absolutely easiest and simplest way to get into recording a podcast, and that's to use your smartphone. And for what you're doing, that may be perfectly good enough. It's not going to have the best sound quality, but the smartphones actually have surprisingly good microphones in them. And there's a number of apps available that do a great job of recording. If you do use your smartphone as a recording device, you'll want to hold it up close to your mouth, just like you'd want to put the microphone close to your mouth, but not directly in front of your mouth, or else you'll get the popping sounds, you know, from the P's, and they call those plosives. So you want to have it close to your mouth, but a little off to the side, and that should get your best recording. Right, now the next thing is, well, where are you actually going to do this recording? You got to have some space to do that. And this is a picture of my little makeshift studio, Conversayer Studios. This is actually an office behind my house that's been transformed into a studio. And you can see that I spared no expense. I'm actually used moving blankets up on the walls to deaden the sound. And everything there is kind of like from here and there, you know. So you don't need to come up with something real fancy. But I just want to explain to you that it's important to have some sound deadening, because hard surfaces tend to bounce sound around. And you don't actually hear it with your ears when you're talking in a room, but boy, the microphones sure pick it up. And so it's important to be in an enclosure where the echoes or the reverberations are as dampened as possible. So there's things I could have done to this room to actually improve it. Sometimes they put little baffles up in the corner, they call them bass traps, because the sounds can bounce around up in the little corners and end up in the microphone. You'll notice that I have a blanket directly behind one of the interview people. And the reason for that is that when, let's say the host is on the left and the guest is on the right, when the host is speaking to the guest, well, their voice bounces off that back wall and ends up in the guest's microphone. And it's really quite noticeable. So you want to essentially dampen that echo, if you will. And there's another similar blanket on the other wall behind the host as well. So you notice that there's also a tablecloth on the table. Again, that's to dampen any echoes or reverberations from the hard surface of the table. There's actually a pad under that tablecloth, to again deaden the sound on that table. In theory, I suppose the other table there in the picture should have a tablecloth on it as well, but the sounds coming off of that are actually going off towards the back there, and you'll see there's another blanket back there to catch them. Okay, so here's some great makeshift alternatives. The first one on the left is literally a closet. It's a bedroom closet. And if you have claustrophobia, it may not be your best option, but it actually works quite well. You'll see what they're using is a sleeping bag and some pillows to provide the sound deadening. They got the microphone hanging from a coat hanger, and you literally close the door and go for it. Looks like there's also a little tablet, which they're probably using as the recording device. Okay, the one in the middle is what they referred to as a pillow fort studio. And this is another popular option. It's a great way to do podcasting on the go. In this case, this is a hotel room. And you can just surround the microphone with pillows to catch all the room noises before it gets into the microphone. And then the third picture shows a box you could actually purchase online with some foam sound control equipment. And these are collapsible, and you just literally put the microphone inside it, and it isolates the microphone from any of the room noises, except of course for the ones directly behind the speakers. So you might need to put some additional sound deadening behind the speaker. Okay, now as far as the recording software, there's a number of different options here. If you're using your computer, most people use a laptop, and the software is called a digital audio workstation. There's lots of different types to use, and they run the gamut price-wise from free to like really expensive. And I've listed them there on the right, basically in that order, from cheap to expensive. Now, these take a little getting used to. There's a learning curve on these things, and it can be kind of steep. So if you're doing a very simple podcast, either a solo or a very easy interview, you might consider some other options that I'm going to share with you. One other thing I wanted to mention is that oftentimes this audio comes bundled with those audio interfaces. So if you get an audio interface, oftentimes you'll have the software you need to do the recording and editing with it. Okay, now here's an interesting option. If all you want to do is kind of like experiment, dabble, this is a really, really easy way to get started. This is an app that runs on either an iPhone or an Android, and on as a web app, and it's called Anchor. It's an app that's owned by Spotify, and what it is, basically it's a recorder. It's an editing studio. It has royalty-free music built in. It'll publish your episodes on Spotify, and from there it can be distributed to other distribution platforms. And it'll also manage stats for you, so you can actually see some statistics around how many listens or downloads you're getting. So it's a real easy way to get into podcasting. You're not going to come out with super polished podcasts. If what you're looking for is a really highly professional sound, this is probably not it. But it is a quick and dirty way to sort of test. For those of you who are familiar with the Lean Startup, it's an MVP, if you will, for podcasting. You'll notice in that picture that it shows 3 people, and you can actually use the app to connect to other people running the same app on their phones and run an interview that way. Okay, and an option that's become like super popular these days is remote interviews. Clearly we're in a situation where we can't get together physically to conduct interviews, but that shouldn't stop you, because we've got something called Zoom that you're kind of probably familiar with, I'm guessing, and you can actually use that to record interviews, say one-on-one, or you could do a panel discussion or anything else you need to do. When you initiate a Zoom meeting, you get a record button, and all you need to do is hit the record button, and you're off to the races. Now, when you stop recording by either hitting the stop button or the end meeting, you end up with some audio files, and they kind of look like over there on the right. You end up with a .m4a file, which is an audio format. You can also record the video itself as an MP4, and then that audio record folder contains separate audio files for each one of the participants. And that's really super helpful if you're going to use the editing software, the digital audio workstation, to put each participant in a different channel. And that way you can adjust the equalization and the volume to get it just right. Now, to make this work properly, it's very important to set the two settings that are outlined in red there. You do want to record a separate audio file for each participant who speaks. That gives you that option. And you want to optimize for a third-party video editor if you're going to be using the video. And what that does is essentially creates the MP4, which you can then bring into a video editing software and then publish to most likely YouTube. Okay, Tanya, have I collected any questions yet?
Yes, you did get one question just right when you were starting, and it was, what do you mean by audio interface?
Yes, was that little box, the little bit of electronics that connects the analog microphone to the computer. It converts the analog signal to a digital signal. And then the digital signal is delivered to the computer through the USB port, through a USB cable. Does that answer the question?
I think so. It looks like it does.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions in there? Doesn't look like we have any other questions. Does anybody else have any questions now?
We covered a lot of material there.
Yeah, and it looks like we're just about 5 minutes before the hour. Maybe we can take just a couple minute break and start back up at
okay.
noon. And if anybody has any questions in the meantime, you can ask them. You can also ask them privately. But let's take a little break now. Let's take a short break, and we'll start back up. I'm sorry, noon is too far. Let's start back up at. It's only 11:53 right now. How long do we think we need, Martin?
5 minutes for a bio break.
Come back in about 5 minutes, everyone. Come back in about 5 minutes. Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tanya.
Absolutely. And let's see if we have any other questions.
He actually answered my question, but because I like I said, I did my first one in Zoom, and there was 5 of us, and I was trying to figure out how to get the files out of Zoom and into a file to where I can share to those guys. But he said that that app is called Anchor, all in one.
Yes.
Correct.
I'm gonna give that a shot tonight because we meet on Friday night.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
If you did you say you already recorded one? I'm sorry, Melvin. You said you already recorded it in Zoom.
Yes.
You should be able to access that, and there's a couple of different ways you can share that. I'll let Martin take it, but yeah.
Yep. So Zoom would be a good way to do that if you have 5 participants. And again, you don't need to use the video portion, but it's there if you want to. There's a couple other apps that you might want to consider that actually work really well. One's called Zencastr. Zencastr, yeah, without an E on the end, it's just Zencastr, I think. And the way that works is that you're talking through the computer, say like a Skype call or what have you, but it's also making a recording locally with each one of the participants so that you don't get the reduction in sound quality from coming through the internet.
Yeah, we kind of ran into that problem too as I was listening back to it. The sound quality drops off.
Yes.
Especially when you're not in the same room, it's a little tougher. because you don't know when the other person's going to start talking, and you kind of step on top of each other and it kind of goes flat.
Yes. So Zencaster actually makes all those local recordings and it collects them into their website and synchronizes them for you. And now you've got a track for each participant that you can edit. And it's a good high quality local recording. Another app that does the same thing is called Squadcast.
Squadcast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that one's very popular as well. So give them a try. Let me know what you think.
Absolutely.
So we have several questions now, Martin. We do have a question from Karina, who wanted to know how you actually go about finding and contacting guests to be on your podcast.
Finding and contacting guests. Well, that is an interesting question, and really comes down to, well, again, what's my objective with the podcast? What's the compelling story I want to tell? Who out there is a subject matter expert, and that takes a bit of research. But one of the things I found in podcasting that I really, really enjoy is the fact that most people are more than happy to talk to you, even if you contact them out of the clear blue. If you say, look, I'm doing a podcast, here's what it's about. I would love to talk to you, and here's some of the things I want to ask. People are more often than not just happy to do that. And it blows me away. I've managed to talk to some very, very interesting people who would otherwise have no reason to talk to me.
And I think it might also help by playing the student card, Karina. Just letting you're a student podcaster. I think that's just one more added little bonus to help.
Good point, Tanya.
So we do have another question from CJ. He said, is there a device that he's heard? Well, there is a device. He's heard in other podcasts where they're able to add sound effects in real time. Do you know?
Yes. Yes. And you know what? Let me go find a slide and I'll show it to you. It was in one of the previous slides that we used. So I should have. Yeah, I should probably go back to these.
I was going to say, while you're looking for that, maybe I'll ask another question.
Okay.
Multi-channel mixers. Can you recommend any multi-channel mixers and microphones?
That kind of goes along with the previous question. So let me share this slide with you. Okay. Now, here's an example of a little mixer that's designed specifically for podcasting. And it's the Rode Procaster. I think that's what it's called. Yeah. It's about a $500 unit. And you can see you can mix actually 4 microphones, 4 XLR microphones, they're analog. And you can also have inputs for a telephone. You can actually connect your smartphone to it so you can do phone-ins. And the little buttons on the right, the colored buttons, can be sound effects. Each one can have an MP3 loaded into it from your computer. And when you hit it, boom, it plays that sound effect. It could be either the intro or the outro, or maybe a funny little noise, whatever it needs to be. You could even load commercials into there and run them through that. And you can use it to either record to your computer, record to an SD card, or live stream. So it's a very versatile unit. Most of the podcast studios that you can rent use that device.
So can you tell me again, Martin, how much that costs roughly?
That little mixer is about $500. I think it's $500 to $600.
So if I find out that enough of you want to do podcasts, we could buy one for the center. I mean, let me know what you guys think.
There's a compelling offer.
Yeah.
You're gonna build a pillow fort too?
I love the pillow fort. That actually is a lot of fun. I'd like to just use that just to play in. Right?
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, that's a good idea. No, we could build a little podcasting studio in there. I mean, I'm excited about it. I think that, especially when I'm starting to hear the ideas from the students, what they're going to be doing.
Great.
Yeah, they all want it. Yeah, they all want it. So what was that called? Okay. Steve wanted to know again. What was the?
I'll send it to you. It's the Rode Procaster or Podcast Pro, one of those things. Yeah, it's Podcast Pro, I think is what it's called. Rode is R-O-D-E. It's an outfit out of Australia. They also build microphones. The 3 microphones that you see in that picture are Rode microphones as well. The longer one is a Rode Procaster. It's an XLR mic, and then the shorter ones are ones they just came out with. They call them the pod mic, and it's like only $100 each, which is dirt cheap for a microphone of that quality. You know, we should probably just go back and do another quick run through these different things. Now, here again is an example of a USB mic. That's a Blue Yeti. Even though it's silver, the company's name is Blue. And those go for about $130 each. And that's a USB microphone. You'll notice that it has a pop filter in front of it. That's always a good idea. Otherwise, you get the popping sound when you use the P's and the T's, you know.
I was wondering about that. I was wondering what.
Yeah. Some microphones have built-in pop filters like these two most likely do. These are both XLR microphones. And the one on the left is mounted on an isolation mount, which means that if you bang on the table, that sound won't transfer into the microphone. The one on the right would definitely hear the pounding because it's not isolated. And these guys are using really nice, those are Shure microphones. Those are kind of expensive mics, around the $500 range each. Yeah, on little mic stands that sit on the table. Very nice. And those have built-in pop filters too. And you notice they also have these foam screens across on them as well. Again, that's to avoid the pops. Okay, we looked at that one. And I guess that's it for those. Okay, any more questions about any of that stuff before we go on?
I tell you, I want to build a little studio.
I'm
loving it.
That's the thing, man. It's a happening thing these days. Okay, let's move on, shall we?
Sounds good. Sounds good. Oh, one more question. Well, everybody's just excited. No more questions. Just go.
Okie dokie. All right. Now, the next topic is publishing and promoting. So, hey, look, you've actually created the first episode of your podcast. It's in the can, as they say. Now, what do you do with it? Well, you got to publish it somewhere. And to do that, you have to find a podcast hosting site. There's actually services out there that are designed specifically for hosting podcasts. So we'll talk about a few of those. Then you need to distribute it to get it on some of these other platforms. You need to promote it. You need to let people know about it. If you just put it out there, this is not a field of dreams kind of scenario, folks. If you build it, they will not come. You need to go seek them out. And also, it's a good idea to kind of understand, well, how's it doing? You know, how many downloads are we getting? So we'll talk about measuring performance. Right, lots of different podcast hosting sites out there. And they're all very good, actually. Some offer more advantages than others, or advantages in different areas. Some are free, or at least free to get started. And so I would say that it would behoove you to just really maybe go to Google and type in podcast hosting, and then go take a look at some of these different ones and with the different plans they have available. I might mention there's also a site called podcasthosting.org, I think, which reviews these sites and provides some recommendations on which ones you might want to use. I'm not going to endorse it because I don't really know how, you know, what's the word, unbiased they are. Don't know exactly what the agenda is there, but it could be worth a look to at least get links to some interesting options there. So the way it works is you create your podcast, you end up with an MP3 file, you upload it to the hosting site, you set up the podcast where you got a landing page, and you put your artwork on it, and then you start uploading episodes, and each episode has its own description, and then the MP3 file. And then what it does is it just makes it available to folks, not only as a web page, but also in a format that they can subscribe to with their podcast app. And that's very important. That's called an RSS feed. You need that in order to not only allow people to subscribe to their apps, but also to get published to things like Apple and Google and Stitcher. Oh, I might mention the SoundCloud is kind of fun because people can actually comment at various points along the way. They can actually pick a spot at, say, 1 minute and 30 seconds in and say blah, 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 blah about what's being talked about right then and there. So that's kind of a cool feature. I haven't seen that on any of the other services. Okay, another option is self-hosting. If you really kind of want to have total control over the look and feel of your site, if you're hosting multiple podcasts, this can be a good option for you. This is actually what I'm doing with Conversayer. You know, like I say, it's a podcast network, and so by definition, we're hosting multiple podcasts. And the way I do that is using WordPress and a plugin called PowerPress. So that PowerPress plugin handles all the plumbing around making that RSS feed that is necessary to subscribe to the podcast. It also handles artwork and that sort of stuff, and really just formats the episodes in a way that can be consumed most easily by the most people. I'm also using a theme called Divi, which is quite very flexible and easy to work with. Happy to take any questions on that. Then you need to talk about distributing your podcast. And these are probably the big four. There's lots of different places that you can distribute to, but I would say as a minimum, you want to hit these four and get your podcast published on those. And instead of trying to explain to you how that works, I've just given to you there some Google search strings you can use to get right to the instructions. I guarantee if you use those search strings, the first item in the return in the response will be the instructions you need. Okay. Then you're going to talk about promoting your podcast. Well, the most obvious and likely way to do that is social media. So again, once you've had the podcast up and published, maybe it's even on some distribution platforms, now you can go out and tell the world about it. And I'm not going to go into any detail about this because this is not really my area of expertise. I'm not very good at digital marketing, but I will tell you that that's probably the best way to get the word out. Another way is to actually, if you've got a mail list, of course, to push information about it through that. And finally, you want to figure out, well, how's it going? You know, who's listening to my podcast? And man, who wouldn't want to have numbers like that on the left? That would be fantastic, but don't expect that overnight. It's a very, very small percentage of all podcasts actually generate that sort of traffic. But that sort of traffic can actually make a podcast quite marketable from an advertising standpoint. The chart on the right is from chartable.com, and again, it shows who's been listening over time. It's just one of many charts that are available, say, through that service. And whatever, and I might mention these are just two of many different podcast monitoring apps there are out there. You know, there's Megaphone, there's PodTrack, there's a whole bunch. What you want to do, though, if you do plan on doing advertising, is you want to get one that that meets that compliance standard by the Internet Advertising Bureau, IAB. So if it's been certified as compliant with their standards, then that's what the advertisers need to say, yep, those numbers are valid. Okay, again, we zipped through that. Hey, some information on additional training and just other sources of information. The first one there is Reddit. I'm sure we're all familiar with Reddit. You know, it's that bulletin board forum kind of software, and they actually have a channel there for podcasting, which might be worth checking out. The podcast host is interesting because they also have a forum, a support forum that allows people like yourselves to ask questions of one another. Podcast Insights has really good training available, as well as this is where a lot of the statistics that I got came from. And there's just all kinds of training available online. Podcast Academy, I think that's free, I'm not sure. And then Udemy, which is that online training platform, has a number of different courses under podcasting. And they advertise them as like maybe $100, $200, $50 for a course. But if you go out there in an incognito mode, it's going to give you an introductory offer of like $12 or $13 for one of those courses. So that's definitely worth checking out.
Martin, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. I just had a quick question. Do you have time for just a quick question right now?
Oh, of course.
So I had some questions about the advertising, and you had said when you get into some of those bigger numbers of people following you, that can really be, you can make some money in advertising. How do you go about that? You know, what specifically do they need to do that?
Well, again, it goes back to the very beginning. Go out there and look at what podcasts are trending, which ones are generating large audiences, you know, and you can get those answers from Chartable. And then you study those podcasts. You say, well, what is it about this podcast that really attracts people? And use that as kind of a model, if you will, to do your own podcast. But of course, you're going to want to try and come up with your own unique hook as well. You know, take what they're using in their podcast that's working, but come up with kind of your own unique angle on it. And that's one way to get a podcast that people will want to listen to, will want to invest their time in. But then you also got to promote it like crazy. Several ways to do that. You know, again, social media is one way. Get affiliated with a podcast network, because a lot of these networks, what they'll do is they'll cross promote. You know, they'll take one podcast that's real popular and then use that to introduce another podcast, maybe even an entire episode. And that's that sort of cross promotion can really help build an audience.
And of course, we can always, if any of you do create a podcast, of course, we'll push it out on all of our social media networks. And
yeah,
we have, you know, not too many, but a little over 1,600 in ours. So small.
Well, there you go. That's great. That's great. And then I suppose the other way to do it is to try and find influencers who already have a big following, and maybe get them to mention something about your podcast. Again, I'm not real good at that sort of thing, but I do know that that's how a lot of people get noticed.
And then in terms of actually getting the advertisers, you know, linking up with the advertisers, how do they do that?
Well, there's advertising bureaus, for one thing. And a lot of these podcast hosting services like Blueberry and Libsyn and some of those others, they actually have features built in to assist with monetization. So in effect, there's two ways of going about this. You can either have like advertisements that are hard-coded in the episode and they never change over time. Or what you can do is you can build breakpoints in your episodes. I guess there's certain markers that you can put into the podcast where they can dynamically insert ads and personalize them and change them over time, so you're not running the same ads all the time. And that effectively you use a bureau or a broker to manage that whole process, and that you get a certain amount per download.
Great, thank you.
You know, another way to monetize is sponsorship. Most of us are probably not going to come up with podcasts that generate an audience of a million downloads per episode, but it may be something still that draws a unique and valuable audience that certain businesses might want to access. And one way to do that is to sell sponsorships in the podcast. Let's see, an example of that would be a podcast called Choiceology. And it's basically a podcast about all the cognitive biases that cause us to make the decisions we make as human beings. And it's actually sponsored by Charles Schwab, if you can believe it. Charles Schwab, the investment trading site. And I guess their idea behind it is that they want people to make good investment decisions. And so they want them to understand what their own cognitive biases are. And so they've got these really entertaining episodes that are hosted by, quality people like MIT professors and stuff on different aspects of cognitive biases. I kind of find it quite interesting. But there's an example of a podcast that's really kind of designed from the ground up to as content marketing, if you will, for the sponsor. Yeah, that's a good example. There's lots of other ones. Oh, I was going to think of another one. Yeah, Carbon. Oh dear, what's that backup software called? Carbon something or other. Anyway, it's the online backup software to back up files on your computer automatically, and they sponsored a podcast on like some of the greatest hacks in history. And so there's another example of a sponsorship that's really a content marketing tool.
Was it Carbon Cabnite?
Carbonite, yeah,
Carbonite.
That's it. Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. So anyway, there's lots of information out there. Again, it helps to kind of do some research up front. I know that all you want to do is hit the record button and get going, but a little planning up front can make a huge difference. Don't worry if the first one's not a polished gem. Practice makes perfect, and again, take a lean approach. Get something out there, see if it resonates with people, get some feedback, and adjust accordingly. Right. Hey, here we are. This is the last slide of the day. So what I would suggest that if you're still interested in pursuing a podcast, that you work on that podcast planner and set up a bit of time with me if you'd like some feedback on it. I'd be more than happy to have a chat with you. You get my email address there, and you can use that Calendly link to set up a 30-minute Zoom meeting with me, and I'd really, really love to hear from you. As I mentioned, we will be sending a link to an online survey here shortly after the workshop today. And if you could just take a couple of minutes to give me some feedback on how you thought this went and what we could do to improve it, I'd really appreciate that. And as a token of my appreciation, I'll send you a link to the slides.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was just wonderful. I learned so much. And I really appreciate you making your contact information available to everyone. I think that's just, it's very generous and wonderful. Thank you so much. So I see a couple of people have, maybe I can see your hands raised now, and it might just be because of the view that we're in now. It might have been before, but does anybody have any other questions? I see a lot of thank yous coming in for Martin, but any other questions from anyone? And you're free to unmute yourself too now if you'd like.
Sure.
This is Melvin again. Just trying to see exactly where you're going to post the link so we can do the survey.
I'll have Tanya send that to you.
I'll actually send it all out in an email. So I'll send it to the email that you used to register for this site.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to do this. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was wonderful, very insightful. I really appreciate it. And thanks all of you for coming. Look out for that message from me. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you all again very soon. Take care. Bye.
See ya. Bye-bye.